There is a blue inside a cathedral in France that people have spent 800 years calling the most beautiful color ever made. It fills the windows of Chartres, a deep, glowing, impossibly saturated blue that seems to hold light rather than reflect it, so intense that when the sun moves behind the glass, the whole stone interior drowns in it, and the very air seems to turn blue. It has its own name, Chartres blue. And for centuries, the story attached to it has been the same, that the recipe is lost. That the medieval masters who made it guarded the formula as a jealous secret, carried it to their graves, and that no one, in all the centuries since, has ever been able to make that color again. It is one of the most repeated pieces of lost knowledge folklore in the world. A perfect tragic mystery, a beauty so great that the very ability to create it simply vanished from the earth. And almost none of it is true. The real story of Chartres blue is stranger than the legend, because the color was never lost at all. And what actually happened to it tells you something uncomfortable about how we decide what to remember and what to let die. First, understand why people believe the myth so easily, because standing in Chartres it feels undeniable. The cathedral holds one of the greatest surviving collections of medieval stained glass on Earth, more than 150 windows, many of them 8 centuries old. And at the heart of them is a single famous panel of the Virgin, robed in that unearthly blue that has drawn pilgrims and painters and mystics for longer than most nations have existed. When the light comes through it, the blue does not sit politely in the window. It reaches into the room. It stains the stone and the floor and the faces of the people standing there. Nothing modern looks like it. The blues in ordinary stained glass, in newer churches, in reproductions, always seem thinner, flatter, colder by comparison. So the mind reaches for the romantic explanation. Surely they knew something we don't. Surely the secret died with them. But when you actually examine the glass, the mystery begins to dissolve. Because the blue of Chartres is not a lost alchemy. The color comes from cobalt, a metal melted directly into the molten glass so that the blue lives in the body of the glass itself, not painted onto its surface. And cobalt blue glass is one of the most thoroughly understood materials in the history of color. The chemistry is documented. Medieval recipes for colored glass in various forms survive to this day. And here is the detail that quietly ends the legend. The workshops that restore Chartres Cathedral now make replacement panels by matching the exact cobalt chemistry of the original medieval glass. They are, at this moment, making Chartres blue. A recipe cannot be lost while people are still using it. So if the color was never truly lost, why did it seem to vanish? And this is where the true story begins. It is far less romantic, and far more revealing than a dying master clutching a secret formula. Around the year 1500, taste changed. That is the whole answer. For centuries, glassmakers had built windows the medieval way, thousands of small pieces of pure, deeply colored glass cut by hand and leaded together like a mosaic, with the color living inside each individual piece. It was slow and difficult and staggeringly expensive. But a new fashion arrived. Glassmakers began painting detailed images in enamel directly onto large panes of clear glass, which let them create windows that looked more like paintings, with faces and shadows and fine detail, and that new style had no use at all for deep, jewel-toned, body-colored blue. The cobalt was still mined, the knowledge was still there. The world simply stopped wanting the thing, and so it stopped making it. Read that again, because it is the real secret of Chartres blue. The recipe was not stolen or hidden or lost with a dying genius. It was abandoned. People chose to stop making it. And after enough centuries of not making it, the color began to feel like a vanished mystery, when really it was just a decision that everyone had forgotten they'd made. Which raises a stranger question than the one we started with. If the color was simply abandoned, then who invented the elaborate legend about a lost secret, and why? The answer is that the myth is much younger than the glass. The story of the tragic, unrepeatable lost blue of Chartres blossomed in the 19th century, in the age of Romanticism, when Europe fell in love all over again with the Middle Ages and hungered to see the medieval world as a lost golden age of mystery and faith and secret knowledge. It was the same era and the same impulse that gave us so many of our lost secrets of the ancients. A color like Chartres blue was irresistible to that imagination, and "we stopped bothering" is an unbearable explanation for something so beautiful. A color like that seems to demand a tragedy, a guarded formula, a dying master, a secret carried to the grave. The plain truth that a society simply decided this beauty was no longer worth the cost is somehow harder to accept than the idea that it was stolen from us by time. It is easier to mourn a lost secret than to admit we let something extraordinary go, on purpose, because the fashion changed. But there is one last turn in this story, because after all of that, after the recipe turns out not to be lost, after the myth falls apart, there is still something at Chartres that genuinely cannot be remade. Not the recipe, the glass. Because you can match the chemistry perfectly and still not reproduce the exact blue in those windows. And the reason is quietly beautiful. Medieval glass was made in crude furnaces, by hand, in conditions we would call primitive. It came out full of tiny flaws, bubbles trapped in the cooling glass, streaks and swirls where the mixture wasn't perfectly even, differences in thickness across a single pane, impurities the makers could never fully control. And every one of those flaws bends and scatters the light passing through it, in a way that perfectly uniform, perfectly pure modern glass never will. Our glass today is simply too clean. The magic of the old blue was never only the cobalt, it was the imperfection. 1,000 tiny accidents of a rougher human way of working, all catching the light at once. And then there is the thing no workshop on Earth can ever supply. 800 years. The glass in those windows has stood open to the weather and the sun since the 13th century. Centuries of light have very slightly altered it. A fine skin of age has settled into its surface. The color you see is not just cobalt and sand. It is cobalt and sand in 800 years of time, worked into the glass itself. You can copy the formula. You cannot copy the centuries. So was the color of Chartres ever really lost? The recipe? No, it was never lost. It was set down, deliberately when the world moved on, and it has been sitting in plain sight the whole time, taken up again whenever anyone chooses to reach for it. The legend of the vanished secret is exactly that, a legend and a fairly modern one. But the exact living blue in those particular windows, the one people still cross the world to stand inside, that, in a way, truly can never be remade. Not because the knowledge died, but because it was never really a formula at all. It was a color, plus every flaw of a lost way of working, plus 8 centuries of sunlight, fused into something no recipe could ever contain. We did not lose the secret of Chartres blue. We lost the ability to be the people who made it, in the world that made it, and to hand it down, unbroken through the light of 800 years. Maybe that is what we always mean in the end when we say a color can never be remade. Not that the knowledge is gone, but that the world it belonged to is, and that no formula, however perfect, can ever give that back.